More on this, let's speak with Peter Leahy. He was the Chief of the Australian Army between 2002 and 2008. Professor Leahy is now the Director of the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra. And Professor Leahy joins us from our Canberra Parliament House studio. Professor Leahy, thanks very much for your time this evening. How did you read what was said today by the PM and Defence Minister in regard to funding for the Defence Force?
Well, I think the most important thing the Prime Minister said was there'd be no reductions for the soldiers, sailors and airmen who are deployed on operations right now, and that's the correct thing to do. I think she could have added also that they'll make sure that those who are preparing to go and those who are preparing for the most likely missions inside the next decade are looked after as well. But beyond that, it gets a little bit confusing. It's confusing in terms of what's being cut, what's being delayed, what the impact is overall in terms of finances. And I think the important thing is that we need to look at the defence and the defence of Australia across a broad spectrum. It's about budgets and white papers, but it's about budgets and white papers in a continuum. So if we look at the 2009 white paper, what we see there is some grand plans, and really they've not been delivered. We've seen that the 2%, rather the 3% per annum promised fund increase has not been achieved. We've seen that capital funds have been returned, and there's a whole range of other savings and issues going on in there.
In regard to the bringing forward of the white paper from that one in 2009, and instead of 2014, now looking at next year, the political leaders today said it was because of the significant developments internationally and domestically since the last paper. From your perspective, have the developments and shifts in the region been that great and that unforeseen to necessitate the forwarding of the new paper, the new blueprint?
Well, just look at the elements. The global financial crisis was in play in 2008 and 2009. Yes, there have been some changes in the geostrategic situation. We've had the United States declare a pivot coming into the Pacific and having a look at the Indian Ocean as well. I think there are some people out there who are making too much of the threat that China might be, and perhaps in a way that really isn't justified. So yes, there have been changes. We are going to see a transition from Afghanistan, but I think it's far too early to say that we'll have all our troops home, and it's certainly too early to say that we can declare victory. We'll be there, as the Prime Minister has said, for at least another decade. So yes, there are some changes, but I'm not sure that they need to bring forward a white paper. I actually think there's more of a political element in this than there's a geostrategic element.
And how do you think that will play within the military, and particularly those who are having to make the decisions, as you pointed out, not just presently, but into the future across that broad spectrum, and as we go into the Asian century and the increasing strategic importance of this region?
Well, I think the issue with this white paper that they've declared is that they said it's to be delivered in the first half of 2013. Well, that's 12 months away. Defence would have been planning for a white paper in 2014, and they're an enormous thing to do. They take a lot of time, a lot of people and a lot of effort. So my fear is that we might just rush a white paper and miss some of those geostrategic changes. I know we've got a good team preparing for it, but it's going to take a big effort, and let's make sure that we get the right issues and the right considerations.
In 2009, analyst Hugh White wrote in an essay for the Leahy Institute that a hallmark of the success of the 2009 defence paper, white paper, would be if its judgments didn't assume that the world would stay the same as it did today. In needing to bring forward the paper by 12 months, has the 2009 statement therefore failed in its foresight, in its planning for the Defence Forces?
Well, I think it's really complicated out there, and we have seen all of these changes. But defence decisions are long-term decisions, and one of my concerns is that we've seen some problems with the 2009 white paper. We're going to see a series of delays more than savings in this budget, and then we're going to see changes in the white paper in 2013. What we need for defence is certainty and continuity. We need to be able to ensure that we've got options available to government across a broad spectrum of possible geostrategic circumstances. And my fear at the moment is that we're going to see the old polemical debate about, is it the defence of Australia against a conventional enemy, the least likely thing that's going to happen, but with severe consequences? Or is it about the things that we've been doing up until now, predominantly the Army, in dealing with stabilisation and peace support, humanitarian and disaster missions, which have been keeping the Army busy and are probably the most likely thing that's going to happen into the future?
Well, how do we maintain that balance then, Professor? Is it possible to maintain that balance?
It's going to be very difficult because of the size of the Australian Defence Force. And so we therefore need to make sure that we don't get too many distortions. And those distortions can occur, one, because we delay things for too long, or two, we buy too many of them. And so if we look at some of the announcements that came out today, the Joint Strike Fighter is a delay, it's not a savings. I have a concern that about 100 Joint Strike Fighters might just be too many. I say that because they are enormously more capable and technologically advanced equipments than the aircraft we've got now, although it's a very good F-18 and the Super Hornet. They're going to be joined by aerial refuelling aircraft, early warning aircraft and a new system of systems. A one-for-one basis of replacement, I think, is really not what we should be doing. So one of those distortions might be too many Joint Strike Fighters. The second issue, a big announcement today, and one that we've really been waiting for, is the commitment of some funds to study the replacement for the Collins submarine. $200 million is a good thing. People have been waiting for that, and we can get started and start to make some really serious decisions, because submarines are essential for the defence of an island nation. The third issue, though, is the one that concerns me a bit, and I think it's a mistake, and that's the cancellation of the self-propelled artillery for the Army. Now, the Army's got to take a bit of a hit every now and again, but I think the cancellation means that the artillery replacement, which provided mobility and protection, just won't be available. And an added concern is that the artillery that's there now, and it's a XM777, which is a 155 artillery, it's not as protected, it's certainly not as mobile, and we need to make sure that with the self-propelled guns gone, we make sure we've got the right number of the XM777, because it's going to have to do a much bigger job now.
Bearing in mind what you've just said there, in an opinion piece in The Australian yesterday, a former colleague of yours, Major General Jim Molan, asked somewhat rhetorically, as the US becomes weaker, where is the logic in Australia becoming pathetically weaker? Is that a question you will also ask of yourself?
I think everyone should be asking that question. We are obliged to be able to defend ourselves. We're also obliged to be able to make a commitment to a joint defence. We've done that for many years very successfully with the United States, so we have to get that balance right. I'm not sure that we're doing that at the moment, and therefore these decisions that might just distort the force structure have to be ones that need to be taken carefully and in a very considered manner.
Professor, while we're still in Afghanistan, on the question of the Australian troops' withdrawal from Afghanistan, we heard a few weeks ago about the revised timetable, that it's being moved forward and happening sooner, the withdrawal. In light of these forecasts for budget cuts and spending delays in the area of defence, how much should we interpret this revised Afghanistan timeline as about being domestic, financial and political imperatives, as much as, perhaps even more so than strategically the right time to pull out of Afghanistan because conditions have improved there?
I'm not so much sure that it's about the economics of Afghanistan. It's expensive, and quite rightly we spend a lot of money to make sure our soldiers can do their job, do it safely and do it well. I think there's more about the politics of Afghanistan and the transition. Partly the politics in the United States, which sees President Obama keen to take Afghanistan away as a political issue, and as a consequence that flows over into the Australian political scene, because any thinning out of the American presence will make it harder for us to stay there. So I think there's a coincidence of the politics. It's not so much about the economics in terms of have we won, have we succeeded, what would it look like 2, 3 or 4 years after we've left Afghanistan? Well, I think there are answers that we're going to find out in those 2 or 3, 4 years.